I was talking about the second form of the body without organs, and the last form shows itself in the form of what they call celibate machine. The character of the celibate machine is that actually here under celibate, what does it mean celibate in Turkish?
Direkt bir çevirisi yok. Yani kelime olarak çevirisi yok da kendini cinsel ilişkiden uzak tutamıyor.
Exactly, you know the meaning of the term. Okay, great. So the celibate machine. What is implied here in this formation is this, okay, this difficult relationship, a new conception again, a difficult relationship between the whole and the parts, okay. Now, in our usual understanding, they have been related in two ways, two possible ways, okay. Either the parts constitute the whole by coming together, or they differentiate out of the whole, remaining still attached to it, okay? Well, here, another different conceptualization, actually inspired by, what was her name, Marie Klein? Melanie Klein, okay. Inspired by Melanie Klein's psychoanalytic approach, actually, okay? So, according to this, the whole should neither be conceived in these two alternative ways, but rather as another part among other parts. Okay? So what we conceive as the whole is another part, nothing else than being a part, okay, in the togetherness with the other parts. What specifies, however, the whole understood as a part is this, okay, that particular part connects itself with the other parts and therefore holding them together, okay. So this means that practically in their analysis, this means that, you know, out of these attraction processes or operations of the attractive forces emanating from body without organs, other desiring machines have been attached to it, okay? But the problem is that with this attachment, body without organs does not acquire organic parts, which we call organs, okay? Simply because they never unite with the body without organs, okay? But remains attached to it, okay? Therefore, body without organs being a part here, another part, but establishing connections with all the other parts, represents or stands for that part which is conceived as the whole, okay? But the important point is that parts in the development of the processes can be separated from the body without organs, as well as new parts or new desiring machines can be attached to it. And practically speaking, when we say desiring machines, you know, we are talking about these things, the mouth and the breast or the hook of something, etc., etc. And again, another Melanie Klein idea, they appear in the form of partial objects. Partial objects is an interesting concept, okay? And actually helps Deleuze and Guattari to overcome that distinction in Lacanian psychoanalysis established between the fantastic and the real. The imaginary, you know, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, there have been devised three different orders or registers, okay? The imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. However, here, what's at stake? Okay, returning to be able to explain this, we need to see what that partial object as a concept stands for. In Melanie Klein's psychoanalysis, partial objects are conceived as the products of the fantastic inclinations of the infant. Okay? So they appear in the fantastic world of the infant as that milk supplying breasts. Okay? It may be connected or may not. At a later stage, Melanie Klein, following Freud's suite, would locate this phenomenon within the Oedipal triangle and connect it with the mother. But for Deleuze and Guattari, this is something to be rejected totally and seriously, okay? Locating these processes within the Oedipal triangle is what they really despise in this book, okay? So therefore, what they do, and helping them to overcome that distinction, Lacanian distinction between the fantastic and the real, is this, okay? These, so to speak, fantastic objectifications of desire on the part of the child's libido turns out to be real because they really affect the experiential world of the child, okay? And indeed, here in this stage, prior to the development of consciousness, we would not be able to say or assume any distinction between what is real and what is not. Fantastic. Interesting point. Forcing us to return to that discussion of matter, Hülle, Aristotelian Hülle, understood within the context of the possibility of acting and being acted upon. Okay. What is matter? When we ask the question, there are several answers. Either as some substantial existence in the form of atoms or particles or whatever else they could be, okay, already existing there, and by coming together and separating from each other, constituting different material bodies, okay. According to the tradition, however, such an interpretation, understanding of materialism turns out to be rather dogmatic. According to Aristotelian understanding, however, what matter is that which shows itself, actually having a certain connection later on with the Nietzschean concept of force, something that shows itself, actualizes itself in this process of acting upon and being acted upon. So all those things which are capable of acting and which are capable of being affected by the actions of other things, okay, are considered to be matter, okay. So matter here does not refer to a substance, but an occurrence, an actualization, okay, acquiring a corporal quality.
But isn't substances ossia? Like
Yeah, exactly, but only in the Aristotelian sense. Ossia means, you know, this. That's all. Here and now, for instance, a certain this. Okay. The problem is, either it's possible to see this as if always and already existing, its existence as given, you know, I can handle this, and I assume that this is the result of a certain formation of the plastic as it is matter. And I assume that matter, plastic, is composed of a certain organization of molecules which themselves constituted by atoms. Now, there may be differences between atoms, different kinds of atoms it's possible to talk about. However, in that case, I can go on to an analysis up to the point where I would be able to find something identical as the very constituting element of whatever it is. Okay? This is the usual approach inspired by atomism. Actually, here atomism does not mean those atoms which we thought indivisible, etc. It simply means that which is indivisible. Okay? The atom in ancient Greek terminology means indivisible. Okay? So something indivisible, meaning something which can no longer be reducible to something else. Okay? So if we are going to follow up that kind of materialism, we would assume that what exists is matter itself. But here, Again, another sort of materialism is at stake, but it's quite different. We are no longer talking about substantial existences in the forms of divisibles or indivisibles, atoms, molecules, particles, etc. Okay? We are talking about that very environment of being affected and acting upon things.
And then something that is only actualized in the process of becoming is not substance.
Yeah, it is at the same time substance. When it consummates, assumes a certain form, it turns out to be that this. In other words, this, according to this approach, is nothing else than the totality of the actions and effects concentrated in this field. Okay? This board marker, okay, when interacting with fire is something prone to change its shape, getting softer, for instance. When I hold in my hand, assuming a form of certain solidity, when I rub it on the board, having a tendency to leave a trace. It has been sold in the market both by me or the institution, etc., etc. All these are being the bunches of actions and effects concentrated in this particular field. Okay? So, concentrated in this particular field, actualizations actually, materializing this something. Okay? Now, if I apply this approach to what Melanie Klein had interpreted as fantastic, or Lacan interpreted as fantastic, okay, we will find out that as long as in Melanie Klein's terminology those partial objects, or in Lacanian terminology, starting with the imago or other fantasies, okay, assumes a material character. As long, of course, and as much as they are capable of acting on things and being acted upon by things. Okay? In other words, as long as they are capable of affecting the life of the individual, so to speak, they are material realities. So such an interpretation, as you can see, helps Deleuze and Guattari to eliminate that psychoanalytic distinction between fantasy and reality. Okay? And according to them, contrary to what Lacan says, reality is here. The production, the constitution of desiring machines, and out of their operations, the produced product are real. And primarily when we are talking about that produced product in that stage, actually we are referring to that partial objects of Melanie Klein or objet petit a of Jacques Lacan. Okay. As we may remember, objet petit a in Jacques Lacan was the consummation or association of desire originating out of a lack with a certain object in the external world. Okay? But actually, in this association, what has been done is the carrying over or transferring or projecting of that lack in the what? In the individual, let me say so, onto that object. Okay? So charging that object with libido, turning that object may be any object, it doesn't make much difference, okay? Charging that object, here, this process, they counter with that miraculating effect, charging that object with libido, turning that ordinary object into a particular object of desire, okay? Making it a special object, so to speak. Actually, in this miraculating process, associating that ordinary object with the capital A. Okay? Here, the object petit a, in the expression of the object petit a, okay, the A stands for the other. Okay? And this is the reason why Melanie Klein calls it partial objects. Okay? Simply because this other, incarnating in that particular object, is far from being capable of satisfying desire. Okay? Simply because the only thing that would be capable of satisfying desire, that object, capital A, the whole order, if you like. Okay? The total order. This time with capital O. So within this framework, that object Pödia being miraculated through its being related with that full order. Okay? However, here, the miraculation occurs in connection with its being connected with the body without organs, not referring necessarily to the big other, especially incarnated and represented in the figure of the mother and father, of course. Okay? So their claim is that their way to escape from the grasping hand of the Oedipal triangle lays in here. Okay? The objet Pödia is not related or attributed to the big other, but rather to the body without organs. It emerges or it gets miraculated through its connection with body without organs, and it cannot be considered as something fantastic, simply because it is as real can be. Okay? A similar notion we will find out again in our later discussions of Jean Baudrillard, when he would claim that, for instance, hyperreality turned out to be more real than the real. Okay, in another context. So, if this was the process taking place in the schizo and schizo's transformation into tamed individual, okay, or it's at the same time the possibility of locating itself as the nomadic subject, we are going to come to this if we would have time, okay, on the surface of the body without organs, here Deleuze and Guattari establish an analogous parallelism, okay, between desiring machines and social machines. Which they analyze within the, so to speak, Marxist traditional conceptualization of history. Therefore, here we are going to talk about three basic social machines, constitution of three basic social machines. Okay, the primitive, corresponding to primitive communal societies in Marx's version. Okay, the primitive machine, the despotic machine, corresponding to especially Asiatic societies, and the capitalist machine. Okay, and then they delve into a discussion of how these operate, okay? For instance, in the case of the primitive machine, what's at stake is, now I'm going to introduce certain new concepts, is the establishment of identity through the territorialization of the body of the earth. Okay? Now, what does this mean? Now, we have seen that actually territorialization always and always in connection with the operation of the desiring machines, okay, which produce infinite series of multiplicities in their language. By the way, their conceptualization of multiplicity had been located in their argument of the relationship, that strange relationship between whole and the parts. Okay, so the whole conceived as being one of the parts simply, but being capable of establishing connections with the others. Okay, now in this sense, multiplicity, the term multiplicity acquires a new meaning. If you would have time, or in this or following our other sessions, I'm going to return perhaps back to this and touch upon that. It's important. Simply because, you know, it has turned out to be nowadays a very popular concept, so to speak. Okay, so we are talking about the territorialization of desire or operations of flows of desire, okay? So by territorialization, it means setting checks on this infinite multiple operations of the flows of desire, okay? Checking or trying to regulate it, so to speak. Remember, desiring machines were operating in two ways, in a binary kind of logic. On the one hand, they appear to be the never-ceasing source of these flows of desire, okay? On the other hand, they appear to be that interrupting mechanisms of those never-ceasing flows, okay? If one desiring machine acts in relation to this particular desiring machine as a source of infinite flow, it acts to another desiring machine, towards another desiring machine, as the interrupting mechanism of the flows. Okay, so they have these double functions. So desiring machines are not pure themselves, while at the same time producing the flows of the desire. At the other hand, they function as to check the desire. That was why they had produced, when they overproduced, the body without organs. Okay, now here again, what's at stake? The formation of the identity or unity, whatever it is, of the society, so to speak, okay? It happens through the territorialization of the body of the earth. Actually, this has been inspired by anthropological studies conducted on primitive societies. This is nothing else than saying that, okay, a tribe organizes space according to kinship ties, okay? Or if you like, if we like to put it in more general terms, according to the prevailing social relationships, okay? So through this allocation of the space, they establish hierarchies, limits and privileges and duties of the roles, etc., distributed in the social space, okay? So there is a rough correspondence between the social organization of space. You are going to be familiar with the concept of the production of space and how the organization of space is related with the social organization of the relations. Okay, so it's quite easy to understand here. Okay, and while the free-floating operation of desiring machines simply operates, and therefore this first stage production is called as well the connective synthesis. Okay, establish connections. Establish connections means between breast and mouth, etc., etc. Okay, means alliances. Okay, establish connections means at the same time alliances. So when it turns out to be a problem of the primitive functioning machine territorializing over the body of the earth, okay, what has been seen is this allocation or organization of the earth according to the systems of alliances, okay? But the weakening of them, enabling one of among their own members. Well, here actually in primitive case of society, as anthropologists argue, we are talking more or less, never perfect. Deleuze and Guattari remind this, okay, several times, never perfect, but more or less, so to speak, egalitarian societies where social stratification has not been developed much, okay, beyond, say, age and sex, for instance, okay, fine. However, Deleuze and Guattari reminds us that what has been assumed prevalent in these societies in the form of generous exchange, gift giving, you know, actually at the same time is the very mechanism that produces debt relations, okay. The relationships between the creditor, if you like, and the debtor, okay. It's through the mechanism of free gift giving, apparently seemingly free gift giving, that these relationships of superiority and inferiority had been established in those societies, which may finally ends up, according to their arguments, the catastrophe, the collapse of this society, this socius, cannot come from within, according to their argument. Actually, it comes, the catastrophe, as the external threat. Actually, practically speaking, the invasion of the society by another, okay? So this gives rise to this invasion, this collapse of the primitive machine, gives rise to that which is called as despotic machine. The prime peculiarity of which is that this system of alliances had been modified, if you like, re-territorialized, and overcoded as a result of the elevation of one of the barbaric horde, members of the barbaric horde, over and above the others. This elevation of the despot enables him to bring forth a new system of alliance in which the connection between the body of the despot and the divine had been established and emphasized. Okay? So, the despot acquires a certain privilege as the representative of the divine on the face of the earth. And by this privilege, elevates itself over and above the others. Okay? Now, this corresponds roughly to the paranoiac machine at the same time. Okay? What has been produced in psychoanalytic terms is nothing other than the paranoiac set of relations. Okay? And here it collapses this time from inside, according to Deleuze and Guattari, giving way to the rise of money as the new body without organs, miraculating everything that has been attached to it. Okay? Now here, the major function actually enters into the picture in the form of fetishism. All these ideas, as you can easily follow, had been borrowed from Marx. Okay? A little bit modified and given new shapes, but Marx is there, talking beneath Deleuze and Guattari's arguments here. Okay? And a very classical understanding of Karl Marx's interpretation. The very method of trying to tell a kind of universal history of all societies, for instance, corresponding that unilinear conceptualization of Marxist history on the one hand, and the very separation of the states as well, corresponding to Marxist interpretation of what happened in history and so on. And what's interesting, however, in the rise of the capitalist machine, first, the capitalist machine, according to their interpretation, deterritorializes, which had been strongly re-territorialized and overcoded system of territorializations of the despotic machine. Okay. Now, when I say despotic machine, primitive machine, and capitalist machine, you should understand this as if I am talking about a new term, socius. Actually, socius is a specific term referring to that body without organs, generated by social machines. This time, its difference from the body without organs proper here is that it's a social product. It is not a psychic product any longer, okay? It's not a psychic product of production of the unconscious, so to speak. Well, it is social product, okay? So it refers to that rigidified systems of coding or territorializations that aims at to check the free-flowing operations of desire, okay? So it means that the established socius in the form of a certain machine, social machine, primitive, despotic or capitalist, aims at delimiting that potentially free-flowing flows of desire, okay? Trying to take them, in other words, under control, okay? Under check. So it means that here in all these constitutions, the free-floating desire is in a tense relationship with the socius, or those machines, okay? So while the despot tries to pin down the territories through its overcoding, reinterpreting and rewriting, if you like, the system of alliances, okay? Not this time only on the body of the earth, but personified on the very body of the person, of the despot. A good example could be actually, even though they think that this refers primarily to Asiatic societies, good example of this would be that depiction on the cover page of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Okay? That depiction of the monarch or Leviathan himself. Okay? At the same time, the body of the monarch. Okay? So, when it comes to the capitalist machine, then it first operates through the territorializing of the flows of desire. Practically, it means that capitalist machine, when it enters into the picture, tends to dissolve all those previously established social relations, okay? And therefore unleashing or setting the desire or flows of desire free. Oh, no longer, when I find myself under the operations of capitalist machine, no longer do I need to fear the power of my father, except of course that Oedipal complex, okay? No longer do I need to take into consideration the accounts, viewpoints, etc., approach of the members of the kin group, okay? I don't have any kin group. We do have only nuclear families here, constituting that triangle of the Oedipus, okay? No kin group, no traditional responsibilities any longer. Therefore, I am free. And in this freedom, actually, what capitalist machine achieves is to bring together its own body without organs in the form of an established capital, while together with the labor which has been set free from feudal ties and connections. Okay? So labor turns out to be free, while the procedures and operations of the capitalist socius or machine operates in a rather irregular manner. Actually, according to Deleuze and Guattari, this relating of the capitalist machine with labor, which is conceived to be free, is nothing else than a very good example of that miraculating effect. Okay? If you are going to be a good laborer, the machine promises you a good life in it. Okay? If you act like a laborer should act, and beneath that proposition of the freedom of labor, they're laying all binding procedures actually, which immediately shows itself after this first effect of deterritorialization in the reintroduction of the reterritorialization and recoding of the flows of desire. Okay. Now, this strange relationship, yeah, they may seem, these terms seem somehow related with each other, territorialization or reterritorialization and coding and recoding, but the difference is this, okay? Difference can be solved over there in the difference between the production of production and production of recording, okay? Production of production is what is going on, what the desiring machines are producing in an unceasing process of acting and being acted upon, so to speak, okay? But the production of recording is the recording of these actions on the surface of the body without organs, okay? And this recording does may not or does not correspond to the actions and counteractions of the desiring machines. In other words, it has been, for instance, in the case of the capitalist socius, it has been recorded in a rather reverse manner, so that capital and labor has been replaced in the process of recording. Okay? While it was actually labor which engaged in the process of production, which really produces, in the recording, it shows itself that it is due to the capital or labor's connection with the capital that labor turns out to be capable of engaging in production. Okay? No capital, no production. This means, okay? So the recording should be conceived as something different from the actual territorial processes of territorialization, reterritorialization, and deterritorialization. Okay. So, while this deterritorialization opens a possibility of the production of schizophrenic subjects, in the Ozan Gattari's terminology, the schizos, okay? Here the processes operating within the capitalist machine, the process of reterritorialization and recoding, however, keeps that despotic nucleus in function, the paranoiac. Okay? So therefore, we've been under the operations of capitalist machine, we have been both at the same time turned into being schizos and at the other hand into paranoiacs, containing that little fascisms of ours in our own selves. Hence, they would gonna talk about the requirements of a revolution on two distinct levels. Okay, at the one hand, if revolution is necessary to overthrow the capitalist machine or socius on a societal, in their terminology, moral level, on the other hand, this is far from being enough, which has been proved by the failures of the earlier revolutions. Okay, the real revolution, therefore, needs to take place on a molecular level, okay, on an individual level, if you like, in individuals' overcoming of those petty fascisms of their own selves. Okay? And the overcoming of this, according to them, is to follow the path of the schizo. Okay? Now, the characteristic of the schizo is this, okay? It has been traditionally described as individuals being unable to contact with reality, being unable to live in reality, okay? And further on, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, however, their definition had underwent a kind of modification in connection with their relationship with the sign system, okay? And the schizo had been defined as an individual which is capable of language acquisition. Okay? In other words, the schizo is the individual who is not capable of identifying him or herself with the I of the sentence. Okay? An individual which is incapable of using language. Okay? Now, Deleuze and Guattari would reject this approach and rather emphasize the schizo's capacity for overproduction. Overproduction, as you have seen, they interpret it as the very source of desire. Okay? And the very possibility of desire. If, for instance, we all as normal individuals are no longer capable of this excessive surplus production in their language, another term borrowed from Karl Marx, okay? That surplus production, the schizo in his or her resistance to be drawn into line through the efforts of anyone. Indeed, they talk about a very interesting episode with regard to Freud's own attitude and experience with the schizos, telling that Freud hated them because under psychoanalysis it was only them who were capable of resisting drawn into line. Okay? Resisting to be encapsulated in the Oedipal triangle, so to speak. Resisting to express every problem, every relationality by referring to mother and father. Okay? So the claim is, practically speaking, and in summary is this. What happens in the operations of the desiring machines cannot simply be reduced to the questions of mother and father. Okay? And they give very beautiful examples from Beckett Place, for instance, and Malo speaking. They asked me what was my mother's name. I don't know. I don't have any idea. I do not care about. I want to talk about bicycles and I want to talk about streets, trees, etc. I don't want to talk about my mother, etc. I want to talk about everything else, and they insist me to connect my speech in each and every time with mother and father. Okay, so this is a good example in showing the degree of reaction in Deleuze and Guattari's theorizing against psychoanalysis. And one important detail, for instance, while Deleuze has been a philosopher, Guattari himself was a practicing psychoanalyst, okay, and in the Freudian school, and over the time he come to reject that, Lacanian school, and over the time he come to reject that Lacanian psychoanalysis, finally culminating in his critique by saying that psychoanalysis does nothing other than encapsulating, imprisoning the individual behind the bars of the Oedipus triangle, which is nothing else than the operation of the capitalist socius, okay, most appropriate to the demands set forth by the operation of the capitalist socius, so that we are good-willing, well-producing tame individuals. Good-willing, well-producing tame individuals would be produced. Okay, another way of approaching this question. Now there are questions concerning methods, etc. One point, let me say this within this couple of minutes which is left for us. As for methods, there are lots of points to be discussed here. I'm just trying to give a quite rough summary, so to speak. But as for methodology, let me introduce you with a certain concept, rhizome or rhizomatique. Okay. Now, this is Deleuze and Guattari's alternative to the organic and structuralist conceptions of a certain methodology. Okay, a methodology of studying things. According to them, we have seen desire is everywhere, desiring machines everywhere, flows of desire are everywhere, producing reality all the time, etc. Okay. Now, here, according to their view, this mass of multiplicity has been tried to put into another cage, which he tend to express in terms of arboreality. Okay, arboreality and rhizomatics are terms borrowed from botanics, as far as I know. Okay, referring to two different systems of roots. One is the tree model. Arboreality refers to the tree model. Okay, here what it offers a system of hierarchies in the organization of the roots and branches, okay, which all are connected in the main trunk of the tree with each other. But it's through the trunk of the tree, through the medici of the trunk of the tree, they are interconnected. Okay, our conceptualization of organism as well as structure functions in this way, according to their interpretation. But rather, the analysis of the operation of desiring machines and flows of desire requires another approach which is capable of connecting everything with every other thing. Okay? This is exemplified by the rhizomatic rooting of the grass. You know, rhizome simply means that branching of the root anywhere and any point in the mass of the grass towards any point. Okay, so this means that if we have a matrix of the events taking place, events of production or events of acting and being acted upon, okay, a mass of events, a multiplicity of events, what is needed to be done is to trace the flows which connect everything with every other thing and how they connect. Actually, this idea of tracing, following up the flows, turns out to be an important contribution to sociological analysis, let me say this. Sociological analysis usually tend to concentrate on stable entities, poverty, level of education, income, etc., etc., okay? However, what has been emphasized in this kind of analysis is the movement of the flows. What flows from where to where, and in this flow produces what, okay? If you adopt such a strategy in your analysis of the social world, for instance, you will see that it has a potential to produce interesting results. Okay, following up the flows of money, following up the flows of ideas, following up the flows of affections, etc., etc., capable of producing really, believe me, interesting consequences, which would enable you to develop quite strange, but strangely attractive at the same time, interpretations of the social. Okay, let me stop here if we will have more time, but unfortunately, our time is limited, okay?